Okay, so today we are going to talk about Cormac McCarthy's The Road and the theme of cannibalism that runs throughout the novel. Just to recap what is happening so far is that we are following this journey of this father and son who are trapped pretty much in this post-apocalyptic world. The Through the father's flashbacks and dream sequences, we have learned that the mother is dead. She went outside of the house in a cold winter night and chose to die over living in this horrible apocalyptic world. Um, so the whole journey has taken its twists and turns, and one of the main themes that we see that the father lives in this perpetual fear that the cannibals, who are the bad guys, are going to come in and capture the kid and consume the kid for food. So the focus on the theme of cannibalism has two layers of meaning in it. On one hand, it establishes the old classical trope of good and evil in apocalyptic literature, that it would be the triumph of the good at the end of all destruction and a new world order would come into being. So through this act of cannibalism, we can distinguish the ones who are participating in this act are bad guys and those who are not participating in this act are the good guys who need to be the ultimate survivor. And the father and son are these so-called ultimate survivors and the good people, um, who are carrying forward in this march where um, there is hope, and there is a duet of hope and despair in the father's mind all the time. But he constantly repeats that the child is my warrant, it's God's warrant. So he has to keep the child alive, from the bad people who have taken over the earth, and the hope is that at the and all this bad would be um, eliminated in some way, and good will rule over earth again. So in this context, we are approaching cannibalism as almost like a determining factor which distinguishes between the two groups of people. So this is one act that would decide this in this post-apocalyptic world, which people or group of people do we sympathize with, empathize with as readers, and the ones that we do not. Okay, so that is one of the purposes of cannibalism. The other purpose is probably a more sophisticated and more critical, more complex idea of cannibalism. Cannibalism, the way it is being represented, is that the earth after this apocalyptic event is left with very few resources, and at this point humanity has lost those orders and those codes where one human being is prohibited from consuming another. So in an ultimate form of consumerism, a culture, remember, McCarthy is writing for a dominantly North American culture where people are defined by their consumerist abilities. One of the defining cultural um, activities is consumerism. So in that context, cannibalism becomes the only act that people who have grown up in that culture can engage in. It's something that is familiar, something that is known. So they are actually exercising the action that they have known throughout their life. And now it has broken the most fundamental codes of a societal living condition, the way a society functions, the way humanity is together. You have to abide by certain norms and rules, and one of those is that you cannot eat another one of your own same species. At this point, the pressure is that this is a culture which has not known anything but consumption. you have nothing else left to consume. That is when you have turned into consuming other human beings. Now you might notice one thing here, that the father and the son also excuse me, consume several things throughout the novel, like the empty coke bottle, no, the not empty, the coke can that they find, and the father gives the child to consume that. Or even at um, the ocean front, when the things are stolen and the father reconsumes their own stuff to take it away. So consumption is a defining factor of this society, and McCarthy somehow is very strongly pointing out the ultimate grotesque nature of that consumerism, where it can go. So the first one is obviously, if you think about just cannibalism as that defining factor between the good and the bad, it helps establish the novel within that genre of apocalyptic writing, where conflict between good and evil is a defining characteristic of the genre. So that has a very unique purpose. But before I go any further, I have to ask you, how realistic do you all think is this act of cannibalism as a dominant human action in a time of crisis? Have any of you ever known of any natural disaster where human beings have taken on to consuming others? Think about the famines that we can think about in our own lifetime. Excuse me. Like right now in Sudan, South Sudan, there is almost a famine-like situation. No one is eating each other. I can also tell you one other example. Have you ever met another person who has lived through really trying times where resources are so scarce, people are dying on a mass scale, there is no way to survive? Okay, so this is interesting. I think I am fortunate to have this life connection. My grandmother was a survivor of 1943 famine, and the stories that I have heard from her are stories which are scarier than anything that I could ever read in a children's book, a fairy tale, or a novel. There were no monsters that could scare me more than the stories of the Bengal famine of 1943. So before I tell you the story, I want to ask you, do you know what Bengal famine was? No, okay. So in 1943, India was a British colony, and Bengal is used to be a presidency. It was a big division, a region under the British rule at that time, and then now it's divided into two halves. One is an independent country called Bangladesh, and the other one is a province, a state within India, West Bengal. So, and it was the Bengal presidency was larger, but that's not the point. The point is, in 1943, 3 million people died just in Bengal presidency because there was a famine. Later, there is this Nobel laureate economist called Amartya Sen. He tracked that it was a man-made famine. There was a record growth in crops and agricultural products in that year, so there was no real reason for there to be a famine. But all the food went to fund the Allies in the Second World War. So the people who grew the crops and the people of the colony were left to die. So one of those striking images from my grandmother's stories are a dead mother and the baby who is going to die soon is still sulking, still nursing. Or stories of, like people like sitting on the sidewalk, just, like people in large groups, they're going to die, and the vultures are waiting that once they die, then they will just scoop in. So these are the real life stories, but not for once have I ever heard of the story that, okay, the baby and the mother was almost going to die, so the 20 something guy was waiting with an axe that as soon as the baby is dead, he was going to chop it up and roast it. a novel. So that is where I find it difficult to have the realistic, empathic relationship with McCarthy's cannibalism. I want to ask you, where do you see your reaction, your effective connection with this whole idea of cannibalism? What does it do to you as an audience when you see that? Do you just feel like, oh, it's all fake, it's all make believe, I don't attach myself with this novel anymore? Or do you see that, no, I understand where the story is like drawing me in? How is the trope of how is the theme of cannibalism depicted in the novel, and what does it do to you as a reader? That's what I want to ask you.